a small shepherd village on the muddy banks of the Tiber River, surrounded by swamps and 7 humble hills. Now imagine that same place becoming the beating heart of the most powerful empire the world has ever known. How did Rome, a city supposedly founded by legendary twin brothers nursed by a she-wolf, rise to rule over 3 entire continents? Think about it for a moment. What makes a civilization not just survive, but thrive through centuries of brutal wars, devastating crises, and earth-shattering revolutions? Was Rome destined for greatness from the very beginning? Or was it forged in the fires of ambition, drenched in blood, and shaped by the sheer ingenuity of its people? Here's what most history books won't tell you. Rome's story isn't just about conquest and glory. It's about a people who turned every defeat into a lesson, every enemy into an opportunity, and every crisis into a stepping stone toward dominance. They didn't just build an empire, they created a blueprint for power that still influences our world today. Welcome to Imperium Chronicles, where we dive deep into the stories that shaped our world. Today, we're unraveling the secrets behind Rome's meteoric rise from a monarchy ruled by kings to an empire that stretched from the foggy coasts of Britain to the scorching deserts of North Africa. We'll explore the epic details that rarely make it into textbooks, the behind-the-scenes political maneuvering, and the incredible human stories that built the foundation of Western civilization. But here's the thing. This isn't just ancient history. Rome's rise holds lessons that are startlingly relevant to our modern world. The same forces that drove Roman expansion, the same political strategies, the same economic principles are still at work today. Understanding Rome isn't just about looking backward. It's about understanding the present. If you're someone who loves real stories that put any fiction to shame, stories filled with larger-than-life characters, impossible odds, and world-changing consequences, then you're in the right place. Hit that like button if you're ready for this journey. Share this with friends who appreciate epic tales, and subscribe to Imperium Chronicles to travel through time with us. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss our next historical adventure. Now let's dive into one of history's most fascinating origin stories. Every great empire needs a founding myth, and Rome's is absolutely wild. We're talking about twin brothers, a she-wolf, and a murder that would set the tone for centuries of Roman brutality. The story goes like this. Romulus and Remus, twin sons of the war god Mars, were abandoned as babies and left to die by the Tiber River. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of perishing, they were discovered and nursed by a she-wolf in a cave on the Palatine Hill. This wasn't just any ordinary rescue story. The Romans believed that being raised by a wolf gave these brothers something special, something fierce and untamed that would define their people forever. But legends have a way of turning dark, and this one is no exception. When the brothers grew up and decided to found a city, they couldn't agree on where to build it or who should rule. So they turned to the gods for guidance through augury, watching the flight patterns of birds to divine the divine will. Remus saw 6 vultures from the Aventine Hill, while Romulus claimed to see 12 from the Palatine. The dispute escalated quickly, as disputes between brothers often do, and in a fit of rage, Romulus killed Remus. Some versions say it happened during an argument over the city's boundaries, when Remus mockingly jumped over Romulus's newly built walls. Think about that for a moment. Rome's very first act as a city was fratricide, brother killing brother. It's almost as if the city was baptized in blood from day one, foreshadowing the centuries of civil wars and political murders that would follow. But here's what archaeologists have actually found beneath all these dramatic legends. Real settlements that tell a different but equally fascinating story. In the 8th century before Christ, the area we now call Rome was home to scattered communities of Etruscans and Latins. These weren't primitive cave dwellers. They were sophisticated peoples with their own technologies, trade networks, and political systems. The Etruscans were particularly advanced. They had mastered metalworking, created beautiful art, and developed urban planning techniques that would later influence Roman architecture. The Latins, meanwhile, were skilled farmers and herders who understood how to work the fertile lands around the Tiber. When these groups began to merge and interact more closely, they created something new, something that would eventually become Roman culture. And here's a detail that most people don't know. The name Roma itself might not even be Roman in origin. Scholars believe it could come from Rumen, an Etruscan word meaning river. If that's true, then Rome was literally named as a tribute to the Tiber River that made the city possible. The river provided fresh water, transportation, trade routes, and fertile soil from its floods. Without the Tiber, there would be no Rome. What's remarkable is how the Romans themselves understood this blend of myth and reality. They never really abandoned their founding legends, even as they became more sophisticated and learned about their actual origins. Instead, they used these stories as a source of identity and strength. The image of the she-wolf nursing the twins became one of Rome's most powerful symbols, appearing on coins, statues, and buildings throughout the empire. This ability to blend practical reality with inspiring mythology would become one of Rome's greatest strengths. They were pragmatic enough to learn from their Etruscan and Latin neighbors, adopting their best practices and technologies. But they were also visionary enough to create stories that gave their people a sense of destiny and purpose. That combination of practical wisdom and mythological inspiration would drive them to achievements that still amaze us today. Now, if you thought Rome's founding story was brutal, wait until you hear about how they actually built their power. Because here's the thing about early Rome. They weren't naturally the strongest, the richest, or even the most advanced civilization in Italy. What they had was something far more dangerous, an absolute refusal to stay down when knocked out. Let's paint the picture of Italy in those early centuries. This wasn't one unified country like we know today. It was a patchwork of tribes, city-states, and confederations, each with their own armies, gods, and ambitions. The Sabines controlled the mountainous regions to the north and east. The Samnites were fierce mountain warriors who dominated the central and southern Apennines. And the Latin League was a powerful confederation of cities that included some of Rome's closest neighbors and rivals. For Rome to survive, let alone thrive, they had to fight. But here's what made them different from every other power in Italy. They didn't just win wars, they transformed their enemies into allies, and their defeats into comebacks that were even more terrifying than their victories. The war with the Sabines is a perfect example of Roman cunning. According to legend, it all started with the famous rape of the Sabine women, though rape here meant abduction, not sexual assault. The early Romans had a serious problem. They had built a city, but they didn't have enough women to sustain a population. So they invited their Sabine neighbors to a festival and then, in a coordinated move, abducted hundreds of Sabine women to be their wives. Now you'd expect this to lead to total war, and it did. But here's the twist that shows Roman political genius. When the Sabine men came to rescue their daughters, the women themselves intervened. They had married into Roman families, had children, and didn't want to see their fathers and husbands slaughter each other. The result? Instead of one side destroying the other, the Romans and Sabines merged into a single people. Rome had just doubled its population and territory through what started as an act of war. The Samnite Wars were a completely different kind of challenge. These weren't political negotiations or clever tricks. This was 3 separate wars spanning nearly 50 years, from 298 to 290 before Christ, and they were some of the bloodiest conflicts in early Roman history. The Samnites were mountain people, tough as nails and masters of guerrilla warfare. They knew every cave, every pass, every hiding spot in their rugged homeland. When Roman legions marched into Samnite territory, they often found themselves trapped in narrow valleys or led into carefully planned ambushes. The most humiliating moment came at the Battle of the Caudine Forks in 321 before Christ. An entire Roman army, consuls and all, was trapped in a narrow pass and forced to surrender. But here's what's remarkable. The Samnites made the Romans pass under a yoke made of spears, a ritual humiliation that should have broken Roman morale forever. Instead, it made them absolutely furious. Rome declared the surrender invalid, handed over the consuls who had agreed to it to the Samnites as prisoners, and came back with an even larger army. They spent the next generation methodically conquering every Samnite stronghold, building roads through their mountains, and establishing Roman colonies in their heartland. By the time they were done, Samnium was Roman, and the Samnites themselves had become some of Rome's most loyal soldiers. But the real test of Roman determination came with their conflict against the Latin League. This was essentially a civil war between Rome and its closest relatives and former allies. The Latins spoke the same language, worshipped the same gods, and had fought alongside Rome for generations. But as Rome grew stronger, the other Latin cities began to fear Roman domination. The Latin War lasted only 2 years, from 340 to 338 before Christ, but its outcome changed everything. Rome didn't just defeat the Latin League, they dismantled it completely and rebuilt the entire political structure of central Italy. Some Latin cities were given full Roman citizenship, others became Roman allies with specific rights and obligations, and a few were simply absorbed into Roman territory. This is where you can see Roman political genius at work. Instead of ruling through fear alone, they created a system where former enemies had a stake in Roman success. A Sabine or a Latin could become a Roman citizen, serve in Roman legions, and even rise to high political office. This wasn't just conquest, it was assimilation on a massive scale. But perhaps the most telling moment in this entire period of expansion came when Rome faced off against Pyrrhus of Epirus, one of the greatest military minds of the ancient world. Pyrrhus was called to southern Italy by the Greek city of Tarentum to help them resist Roman expansion. He brought with him something Rome had never faced before: war elephants. Picture this: Roman soldiers who had spent their entire careers fighting other Italians with swords and spears, suddenly facing massive elephants charging at them with armed riders on their backs. At the Battle of Heraclea in 280 before Christ, Pyrrhus won a complete victory. His elephants broke the Roman lines, his superior cavalry dominated the battlefield, and his professional soldiers outfought the Roman legions. Any other city might have sued for peace. Rome sent ambassadors to negotiate terms. But when Pyrrhus offered to make peace in exchange for Rome giving up its recent conquests in southern Italy, the Roman Senate's response was essentially, "Thanks, but no. We'll see you on the next battlefield." Pyrrhus won again at Asculum the following year, but this time something different happened. As he surveyed the aftermath of his victory, looking at the thousands of his own dead soldiers scattered across the field, Pyrrhus made one of the most famous observations in military history. "One more victory like this, and I shall be lost." And that's exactly what happened. Pyrrhus had superior tactics, better training, and those terrifying elephants. But Rome had something he couldn't match, and seemingly infinite ability to absorb losses and come back stronger. While Pyrrhus was running out of soldiers, Rome was drafting new legions from its ever-expanding pool of citizens and allies. By 275 before Christ, Pyrrhus had given up and sailed back to Greece, leaving the Greek cities of southern Italy defenseless against Roman conquest. Rome had learned how to fight elephants, how to counter professional Greek military tactics, and most importantly, they had proven that they could outlast anyone in a war of attrition. What's remarkable about this entire period is how Rome transformed each conflict into a stepping stone toward greater power. They didn't just defeat their enemies. They studied them, learned from them, and incorporated their best qualities into Roman culture and military practice. Samnite military engineering became Roman military engineering. Latin political institutions became Roman political institutions. Greek military tactics became Roman military tactics. By the time Rome had conquered the Italian peninsula, they weren't just Romans anymore. They were a fusion of dozens of different peoples, unified by Roman law, Roman citizenship, and Roman ambition. And they were just getting started. Now, if you think Rome's conquest of Italy was impressive, you haven't heard anything yet. Because across the Mediterranean Sea, there was another power that had been building its own empire, while Rome was busy fighting mountain tribes and city-states. This was Carthage, and the conflict between these two civilizations would become the stuff of legends. Carthage wasn't just another enemy. This was a maritime superpower that controlled trade routes across the entire Mediterranean. While Rome had been learning how to fight on land, Carthage had been mastering the seas. They had colonies in Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, and North Africa. Their merchants were everywhere, their navy was unmatched, and their wealth was staggering. But here's what made Carthage truly dangerous. They had something Rome desperately wanted: Sicily. This large island sat right between Italy and North Africa, controlling the sea routes between east and west. For Rome to truly dominate the Mediterranean, they needed Sicily. For Carthage to maintain their trade empire, they needed to keep Sicily. Something had to give. The First Punic War lasted 23 years, from 264 to 241 before Christ. And here's the crazy part. Rome, a land-based power with virtually no navy, decided to challenge the greatest naval empire of the ancient world at sea. It was like a mountain climber challenging a fish to a swimming contest. But Rome did what Rome always did. They learned. They captured a Carthaginian warship that had run aground, took it apart piece by piece, and reverse-engineered it. Within months, they had built an entire fleet. They even invented a new type of naval warfare, adding boarding bridges called corvus to their ships so they could turn sea battles into land battles. Rome won that first war, but barely. They lost hundreds of ships and thousands of men learning how to fight at sea. But they got Sicily, and more importantly, they had proven they could adapt to any type of warfare. The Second Punic War, though, that's where things got really intense. This time, Carthage had a secret weapon, a 26-year-old general named Hannibal Barca, and he had a plan so audacious it still takes your breath away. Instead of attacking Rome by sea where they would expect it, Hannibal decided to march overland from Spain, through southern France, and over the Alps into northern Italy, with elephants, in winter. This wasn't just military strategy, this was pure genius, mixed with absolute madness. Picture this scene. Hannibal's army consisted of about 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. They were marching through terrain that would challenge modern mountaineers, in weather that could kill you in hours, carrying enough supplies to sustain a massive army. The crossing took 15 days, and it was a nightmare. The narrow mountain paths crumbled under the weight of elephants. Avalanches buried entire units. Local tribes attacked the column from hidden positions in the rocks. Men froze to death in their sleep. By the time Hannibal's army stumbled down into the Po Valley, he had lost nearly half his men and most of his elephants. But here's the thing. He made it. Against all odds, against all logic, Hannibal had done the impossible. He had brought an army with elephants over the Alps in winter, and Rome was completely unprepared for what happened next. Hannibal's first victory came at the Tiber River, where he used the surviving elephants to devastating effect against Roman legions who had never seen such creatures in battle. The psychological impact was enormous. Imagine being a Roman soldier, trained to fight other men with swords and spears, suddenly facing a massive elephant charging at you with armed riders on its back. But Hannibal was just getting started. At Lake Trasimene, he pulled off one of the most brilliant ambushes in military history, hiding his entire army in the hills around the lake, and then slaughtering an entire Roman army as they marched through the morning mist. 15,000 Romans died in a single day. Rome was in full panic mode. This wasn't like their previous wars where they could afford to lose a battle or two and come back stronger. Hannibal was in Italy, winning every engagement and getting closer to Rome itself with each victory. Then came Cannae in 216 before Christ. This battle is still studied in military academies today because of its tactical brilliance. Hannibal deliberately weakened his center, allowed the Romans to push forward, and then had his flanks close in from both sides. The result was the complete annihilation of the largest army Rome had ever fielded. 80,000 Romans died in a single day, including consuls, senators, and the flower of Roman youth. At this point, any other city would have surrendered. Hannibal's allies were telling him to march on Rome immediately and end the war. But Hannibal hesitated, perhaps because he knew his army was too small to actually capture and hold the city. And that hesitation gave Rome time to do what Rome did best: survive, adapt, and come back stronger. They appointed Fabius Maximus as dictator, a man who understood that Rome couldn't beat Hannibal in open battle. So instead, he invented a new strategy: shadow Hannibal's army, avoid major engagements, attack his supply lines, and slowly wear him down. This strategy was so frustrating that Hannibal called Fabius the delayer. But it worked. Year after year, Hannibal won tactical victories, but couldn't achieve strategic success. He controlled the countryside but couldn't take the major cities. His allies began to defect back to Rome. Meanwhile, Rome was learning from every defeat. They studied Hannibal's tactics, adapted their own strategies, and slowly began to turn the tide. The breakthrough came when they opened a second front by invading North Africa itself, forcing Carthage to recall Hannibal to defend their homeland. The final showdown came at Zama in 202 before Christ. This time, Rome had learned how to fight elephants, and they had their own brilliant general, Scipio Africanus, who had studied Hannibal's tactics and turned them against him. Hannibal was finally defeated, and the Second Punic War was over. But Rome wasn't done with Carthage, not by a long shot. The Third Punic War, from 149 to 146 before Christ, was less a war than a systematic destruction. Rome had decided that as long as Carthage existed, they would never truly be safe. Cato the Elder ended every speech in the Roman Senate with the same phrase: Carthage must be destroyed. And when Rome finally got their excuse for war, they showed no mercy. They besieged Carthage for 3 years, and when the city finally fell, they did something that shocked even their own allies. They sold every surviving Carthaginian into slavery, demolished every building, and then, according to legend, plowed salt into the fields so that nothing would ever grow there again. Did you know that the Romans actually threw salt on Carthage's farmland to ensure nothing could ever grow there again? That's not just defeating an enemy, that's erasing them from history. That level of rivalry and complete destruction shows just how seriously Rome took this threat. If you're finding this story as epic as I am, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Which ancient empire would you like to see featured in our next video? Your engagement helps us bring these incredible historical stories to life. The destruction of Carthage marked the end of the Punic Wars, but it also marked the beginning of something new. Rome had proven they could defeat any enemy, no matter how powerful, no matter how clever. They had survived their greatest existential threat and emerged stronger than ever. But in doing so, they had also shown a capacity for absolute ruthlessness that would define their empire for centuries to come. Here's where Rome's story takes a dark turn. Success, it turns out, can be just as dangerous as failure. By the 2nd century before Christ, Rome controlled most of the Mediterranean world. Wealth was pouring in from conquered territories, slaves were working the fields, and Roman generals were returning home as heroes with unimaginable riches. But all this success was tearing the Republic apart from the inside. The problem was simple but deadly. Rome's political system had been designed for a small city-state, not a world empire. The Senate, the consuls, the popular assemblies, all of these institutions worked fine when Rome was just another Italian city fighting its neighbors. But when you're trying to govern territories stretching from Spain to Greece, from Britain to Egypt, the old system starts to crack under the pressure. And the cracks showed up first in the most basic place imaginable: farmland. Here's what was happening. Roman soldiers were spending years, sometimes decades, fighting in distant campaigns. While they were gone, their small family farms were either neglected or sold off to pay debts. Meanwhile, wealthy Romans were buying up huge estates worked by slave labor from the conquered territories. When veterans finally came home from war, they often found they had no land to work and no way to make a living. This is where 2 brothers named Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus enter our story. These weren't radicals or revolutionaries, They were from one of Rome's most prestigious families. But when Tiberius became tribune of the people in 133 before Christ, he saw what was happening to Roman farmers and decided to do something about it. Tiberius proposed land reform, take some of the public land that wealthy Romans had been using illegally and redistribute it to landless veterans. It sounds reasonable, right? But in Roman politics, reasonable proposals could get you killed. The wealthy senators were furious. This wasn't just about land. It was about power. If poor Romans got their own farms back, they wouldn't be dependent on wealthy patrons for jobs and food. They might start voting for their own interests instead of following the lead of the aristocracy. When Tiberius pushed his land reform through the popular assembly, bypassing the Senate entirely, he crossed a line that hadn't been crossed in centuries. Roman politics had always been about compromise and consensus among the elite. Tiberius had appealed directly to the people over the heads of the Senate. The response was swift and brutal. During the next election, a mob of senators and their supporters, led by the chief priest himself, clubbed Tiberius and 300 of his followers to death right on the Capitoline Hill. Think about that. Senators, the supposed dignified leaders of Rome, personally beating a tribune to death with clubs and stones. 10 years later, Tiberius's younger brother Gaius tried to continue the reforms. He was even more radical, proposing subsidized grain for the urban poor and extending citizenship to Rome's Italian allies. The result was the same, another massacre, this time with 3,000 dead, including Gaius himself. The Gracchi brothers had opened Pandora's box. They had shown that you could bypass the Senate and appeal directly to the people. But they had also shown that the established elite would literally kill to maintain their power. Roman politics would never be the same. The next phase of the crisis centered around two men who couldn't have been more different, Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Marius was a new man, someone from outside the traditional aristocracy who had risen through military merit. Sulla was old aristocracy, a traditionalist who believed in the ancient privileges of the Senate. Marius revolutionized the Roman army. Instead of recruiting only property-owning citizens for short campaigns, he opened the legions to landless volunteers who would serve for decades. These professional soldiers were incredibly effective, but they were also loyal to their generals rather than to the state. When Marius promised his veterans land and citizenship, they followed him, not the Senate. The conflict between Marius and Sulla turned into Rome's first real civil war. In 88 before Christ, Sulla actually marched his legions on Rome itself, something that had never happened before. Roman soldiers were fighting Roman soldiers in the streets of the capital. When Sulla won, he did something that shocked even hardened Romans. He posted lists of his political enemies and declared them outlaws. Anyone could kill these men and claim a reward. It was called proscription, and it turned Rome into a city of assassins. Thousands died, including senators, knights, and ordinary citizens whose only crime was being on the wrong side politically. But here's the thing about violence in politics. Once you start, it's almost impossible to stop. Sulla tried to restore the old system, strengthening the Senate and limiting the power of popular tribunes. But he had taught ambitious Romans a crucial lesson. If you have the loyalty of the legions, you can take whatever you want. Enter Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar was everything the old Roman aristocracy feared: brilliant, ambitious, charming, and absolutely ruthless. He understood that the Republic was dying, and that the future belonged to whoever could command the loyalty of both the soldiers and the people. Caesar formed an alliance with two other powerful men, Pompey the Great, Rome's most successful general, and Marcus Crassus, the richest man in Rome. This first triumvirate, as historians call it, wasn't official. It was a secret agreement to divide power among themselves while maintaining the fiction of the Republic. Caesar got what he wanted most: command of Gaul, modern-day France. For 8 years, from 58 to 50 before Christ, Caesar conquered all of Gaul, invaded Britain twice, and even crossed the Rhine to fight Germanic tribes. He made himself fabulously wealthy, trained a veteran army that was fanatically loyal to him, and wrote brilliant accounts of his campaigns that made him famous throughout the Roman world. But back in Rome, the triumvirate was falling apart. Crassus died fighting the Parthians in the east. Pompey grew jealous of Caesar's success and began to see him as a threat. The Senate, terrified of Caesar's growing power, ordered him to disband his armies and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar faced a choice: obey the Senate's order, return to Rome defenseless, and probably face prosecution and exile, or march his armies south and fight for control of the Republic. On January 10th, 49 before Christ, Caesar stood on the banks of the Rubicon River, the boundary between Gaul and Italy. According to law, no general could bring armed forces across this river. To do so was to declare war on Rome itself. Caesar's officers were nervous. This wasn't just insubordination, this was treason. If they lost, they would all be crucified. But Caesar had made his decision. Alea iacta est, he said. The die is cast. And with those words, he led his 13th legion across the Rubicon. The Second Civil War was swift and decisive. Caesar's veterans were better trained and more motivated than the hastily assembled forces of the Senate. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was murdered by local officials who thought they were doing Caesar a favor. Within 4 years, Caesar was the undisputed master of Rome. But Caesar made one crucial mistake. He tried to preserve the forms of the Republic while exercising the power of a king. He kept the Senate, maintained the traditional offices, and insisted he was just the first citizen. But everyone knew the truth. Caesar appointed governors, commanded all the armies, and made decisions that affected the entire Mediterranean world. On the Ides of March 15th, 44 before Christ, a group of senators led by Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius decided that the only way to save the Republic was to kill the man who had destroyed it. They stabbed Caesar to death at the base of Pompey's statue in the Senate House, believing that his death would restore the old system. They couldn't have been more wrong. Caesar's assassination didn't save the Republic. It delivered the final blow. The Roman people had grown accustomed to strong leadership and effective government. The old system of squabbling senators and annual magistrates seemed chaotic and ineffective compared to Caesar's decisive rule. More importantly, Caesar had an heir, his great-nephew Octavian, who would later become Augustus, the first Roman emperor. The Republic was dead, even if it took a few more years for everyone to admit it. The age of the emperors was about to begin. The tragedy of the late Republic is that it died not from external conquest, but from internal contradictions. The very success that made Rome great, the conquests, the wealth, the expansion, created problems that the Republican system couldn't solve. When traditional institutions failed, Romans turned to strongmen who promised order and effectiveness. But in gaining security, they lost their freedom. Now here's where the story gets really fascinating, because what happened next was one of the most brilliant political transformations in human history. Caesar's great-nephew, a sickly 18-year-old named Octavian, was about to pull off the greatest con job in political history. He was going to become Rome's first emperor while convincing everyone that he had actually restored the Republic. When Caesar died, most people expected Octavian to fade into obscurity. He was young, inexperienced, and had no military background. But what he lacked in experience, he made up for in political genius and absolutely ruthless ambition. The first thing he did was claim Caesar's name, calling himself Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. In Roman culture, names carried enormous power, and by taking Caesar's name, Octavian was claiming his legacy. But Octavian wasn't the only one with ambitions. Mark Antony, Caesar's lieutenant and closest friend, expected to inherit Caesar's power. Marcus Lepidus, another of Caesar's allies, controlled several legions. For 13 years, these three men fought each other in a series of civil wars that nearly tore the Roman world apart. The second triumvirate, unlike the first, was official and brutal. The three men published proscription lists, just like Sulla had done, marking hundreds of their political enemies for death. One of the most famous victims was Cicero, Rome's greatest orator, whose hands and head were nailed to the speaker's platform in the Forum as a warning to anyone who opposed them. But Octavian was playing a longer game than his rivals. While Antony was in Egypt, falling in love with Cleopatra and dreaming of founding a new dynasty in the East, Octavian was back in Rome, carefully building his reputation as a defender of traditional Roman values. When the final showdown came at the Battle of Actium in 31 before Christ, it wasn't just a military conflict. It was a propaganda war between Roman tradition and foreign corruption. Octavian's victory at Actium made him the undisputed master of the Roman world. Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide in Egypt, and suddenly the young man who had been dismissed as Caesar's inexperienced heir was the most powerful person on earth. But here's where his political genius really showed. Instead of celebrating his victory and declaring himself dictator like Caesar had done, Octavian did something completely unexpected. In 27 before Christ, Octavian appeared before the Senate and announced that he was giving up all his extraordinary powers and returning control of the state to the Senate and people of Rome. He claimed he had completed his mission of restoring peace and order, and now he wanted to return to being just another citizen. The Senate was stunned. No one had expected this. But of course, this was all carefully orchestrated theater. The senators, many of whom owed their positions to Octavian's favor, immediately begged him to reconsider. They granted him the title Augustus, meaning the revered one, and gave him a collection of powers that made him effectively an emperor while maintaining the fiction that the Republic had been restored. This is political propaganda at its finest. Augustus, as Octavian was now called, spent the rest of his reign insisting that he had restored the Republic. His official autobiography, carved in stone and displayed throughout the empire, claimed that he found Rome brick and left it marble, and that he had given back the state to the Senate and people of Rome. But the reality was completely different. Augustus controlled all the armies, appointed all the governors, and made all the important decisions. The Senate still met, the consuls were still elected, and the traditional ceremonies continued. But everyone understood that real power lay with Augustus. It was brilliant. He had all the authority of a king, but none of the negative associations that came with monarchy. Augustus ruled for 45 years, from 27 before Christ to 14 after Christ, and during that time he transformed not just Rome, but the entire concept of government. He created the Praetorian Guard, an elite unit that was supposedly there to protect the emperor, but actually existed to ensure his control over the capital. He established a professional civil service to run the empire efficiently. He reformed the army, creating permanent legions stationed on the frontiers. But perhaps Augustus's greatest achievement was something that historians call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For the first time in centuries, the Mediterranean world was united under a single authority that could maintain order and protect trade. No more civil wars, no more pirates disrupting commerce, no more constant warfare between city-states and kingdoms. This peace allowed Roman civilization to flourish in ways that still amaze us today. The Romans built roads that connected every corner of the empire, and many of these roads are still in use today, 2,000 years later. They constructed aqueducts that brought fresh water to cities hundreds of miles from the nearest river. They built amphitheaters, baths, forums, and temples that showcased the glory of Roman engineering. But Augustus understood that controlling an empire required more than just roads and legions. He needed to win the hearts and minds of his subjects. So he created something entirely new in human history, a systematic imperial cult that made the emperor into a living god. Now, this wasn't necessarily because Augustus thought he was actually divine. This was sophisticated political psychology. In the eastern provinces, people were already accustomed to worshiping their rulers as gods. It had been a tradition since the time of Alexander the Great. But Augustus extended this practice throughout the empire, creating temples and festivals dedicated to Rome and Augustus. The genius of this system was that it gave people throughout the empire a shared identity. A farmer in Britain, a merchant in Egypt, and a soldier in Germany could all participate in the same rituals, worship the same imperial family, and feel like they were part of something larger than themselves. It was cultural unification on a scale that had never been attempted before. Augustus also revolutionized Roman law in ways that still influence legal systems today. He created a standardized legal code that applied throughout the empire, ensuring that a Roman citizen would receive the same justice whether they were in Rome or in a distant province. This legal system was so effective that it survived the fall of the Western Empire and became the foundation for legal systems throughout Europe. The emperor also understood the power of architecture and public works as propaganda tools. He didn't just build monuments to glorify himself, though he certainly did that too. He built practical infrastructure that improved people's daily lives: markets, baths, theaters, libraries. When people used these facilities, they were reminded every day of Augustus's generosity and effectiveness as a ruler. One of the most telling examples of Augustus's political genius was how he handled succession. The Roman Republic had failed partly because there was no clear way to transfer power peacefully. Augustus spent decades carefully grooming heirs, adopting promising young men into his family, and gradually introducing them to public life. When he died in 14 after Christ, his stepson Tiberius took power smoothly, without civil war or political chaos. Augustus had solved the fundamental problem that had destroyed the Republic: how to govern a world empire effectively while maintaining legitimacy and popular support. His solution, the Principate, as historians call it, lasted for centuries. Even when the empire eventually split and transformed, the basic model of imperial government that Augustus created continued to influence European politics for over 1,000 years. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Augustus was how completely he transformed himself and Rome while making it seem like nothing had really changed. He claimed to be restoring the past while actually creating something entirely new. He presented himself as a humble servant of the state while wielding absolute power. He maintained all the traditional forms of republican government while making sure that real authority rested with him alone. In the end, Augustus succeeded where Caesar had failed because he understood that Romans needed to believe they were still living in a republic, even as they accepted the reality of imperial rule. He gave them the stability and prosperity of empire wrapped in the comfortable fiction of traditional government. It was a masterpiece of political theater that established a model of leadership that would define Western civilization for centuries to come. And here we stand at the end of our journey through 7 centuries of Roman ambition, blood, and brilliance. You know, there's an old saying that Rome wasn't built in a day, but here's what they don't tell you. It wasn't destroyed in one either. The rise of Rome wasn't some magical transformation that happened overnight. It was a web of bold choices, brutal mistakes, and relentless adaptation that stretched across generations. Think about it. From those legendary twin brothers nursed by a wolf to Augustus standing as the first emperor, we're talking about over 700 years of constant evolution. What fascinates me most is how Rome never stopped learning from its enemies. When Hannibal brought elephants across the Alps and nearly destroyed them, did they give up? No. They studied his tactics and came back stronger. When the Gauls burned their city to the ground in 390 before Christ, did they rebuild in the same old way? Not a chance. They fortified, they expanded, they adapted. But here's the question that keeps me awake at night. Are we living through our own Roman moment right now? Look around our modern world. The political divisions, the economic tensions, the clash between tradition and change. Sound familiar? Rome's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness, the hunger for more. More territory, more power, more control. They conquered 3 continents, but in doing so, they planted the seeds of their own transformation from republic to empire. The very success that made them powerful eventually changed them into something completely different. Today, as we watch nations rise and fall, as we see empires of technology and economics reshape our world, I can't help but wonder, are we destined to repeat this ancient cycle? Will our modern civilizations face the same choices between expansion and stability, between power and principles? The Romans believed they were eternal. They called their empire the Eternal City. Yet nothing is truly eternal except the lessons we choose to learn from the past. If this journey through Rome's incredible rise has opened your eyes to history in a new way, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, what lesson from Rome's rise feels most relevant to our world today? Is it their genius for adaptation, their ruthless pragmatism, or maybe their warning about the price of unchecked ambition? Your thoughts matter because history isn't just about dusty old books and forgotten empires. It's about understanding the patterns that still shape our lives today. Every comment you leave, every insight you share, helps us all see the present more clearly through the lens of the past. If you loved diving deep into the Roman world with me, show some love by hitting that like button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more epic historical adventures. Share this video with anyone who loves a good story about underdogs becoming legends. Because let's face it, Rome's rise is the ultimate comeback story in human history. And here's the big one. If you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for Imperium Chronicles. We've got so many more incredible journeys through history waiting for you. From the rise and fall of empires to the forgotten heroes who changed the world, we're just getting started on this adventure through time. Until our next historical journey together, remember, the past isn't just prologue. It's preparation for the future we're building today. See you in the next episode.